This video features Dr. Katrina Fulcher-Rood of Buffalo State University here in New York. She's a researcher, and her research really appeals to me because she looks deeply at how speech-language pathologists approach their disability evaluations. And in this video, she's going to talk about what she's learned from her research.
Hello everyone, my name is Katrina Fulcher-Rood. I'm an associate professor and speech-language pathologist, and currently I'm working at SUNY Buffalo State College. I'm very excited to talk to you today about work that I have done with my colleagues about what is currently happening in child language assessment. And in order to determine what is happening in realistic and naturalistic clinical settings, my colleagues and I are so lucky and we're so grateful that we work with speech-language pathologists so we can really understand what assessment tools they're using, why they use those assessment tools, and how SLPs go about diagnosing language impairment in school-age children. And when starting today and putting this together, I really want us to hold this together as a theme and as a potential for us about where maybe we can change and move forward in our own assessment practices. And as speech-language pathologists, we know how powerful language can truly be. Language holds power. It gives us the ability to suggest or provide directions, and it also can reflect the beliefs that we hold as professionals, or maybe even the beliefs that we have in assessment tools and what our assessment tools can and cannot do. So what happens if we switch our lens and we switch our language to that we aren't just testing, but we evaluate or we assess? When you think about that word test, what does that evoke for you versus when we evaluate or assess? To me, evaluation and assessment provides more of a holistic view where we're looking at overall performance or language performance in multiple contexts. And what about how we formally assess versus what we informally assess? This idea of formal tools versus informal assessment tools. This language can create a power dynamic, and I really believe that this is one of the starts or one of the areas that we've created this unintentional consequence of this perception that we may view something like a standardized test or a formal assessment as being more important or maybe more inherently trustworthy than something that is quote unquote informal. So let's keep that in mind as we go throughout the rest of the talk today. And so I'm really here to address what is currently happening in child language assessment. And what my colleagues and I have found from various surveys that we have conducted, as well as doing qualitative, semi-structured interviews, is that SLPs, primarily these are school-based SLPs, will report using a combination of standardized testing and informal measures. Now, while school-based SLPs will report using a variety of these tools, we have found that standardized testing is the most relied upon tool in terms of what tools are used, why they're used, and the tool and the data that is relied upon most to make diagnostic decisions about which children do and do not have language impairments. And from an unpublished survey that we're looking at, we know that 80% of school-based SLPs are reporting using 2 or more standardized tests for their diagnostic and evaluative purposes. This is from a study that my colleagues and I conducted in 2019, and we did a simulated assessment task, and we selected child language data that was collected in a larger study. So this data that we actually presented to school-based SLPs is realistic, naturalistic child language data. These are children that we went and saw, quote unquote, in the wild. And we selected these children and their child language profiles very specifically so that we could show SLPs either a balance or an imbalance between quote unquote formal and informal testing. So what does that mean? If we look at the case 1 here, case 1 has what we refer to as congruent information, meaning that all data leads you down to the same path. So whether you're looking at standardized testing or quote unquote informal measures such as parent questionnaires, teacher questionnaires, or a language sample, all of the data is sharing or showing the same story. So in the case of case 1, we can see that standardized testing as well as those other measures are suggesting that this is a typically developing child. Versus case 2, also again congruent information where standardized testing and other measures are all leading us down the same path, but we can see here that these standardized test scores are below average and outside of normal limits, as well as that there are concerns from the teacher and the parent, and there is a low mean length utterance score. Cases 3 and 4 are where we really get interesting and where we really start to see how data is used to make diagnostic decisions. So case 3 and 4 are what we call incongruent cases, meaning the data is disparate or doesn't really fit nice and perfectly and lead you down that path. So you'll see here for case 3, standardized testing is within normal limits. However, parents are concerned, teachers are concerned, and if you look into a language sample, you'll see that this child is very ungrammatical. The opposite is true for case 4. Again, incongruent information where standardized testing is below normal limits, but our other measures are not indicating any concerns about language. And case 5 is a congruent case, but what we usually refer to in the field as those borderline cases, where there's some concerns and where that standardized testing is falling right in that cutoff range or that below average range. So we had SLPs review all of this assessment data, and we asked them to make diagnostic decisions about if they would or would not diagnose these children with language impairments. And this is what we found. With our first 2 cases, case 1 and 2, which were both congruent information, case 1, we had 100% consensus, and that all SLPs in our study determined that this case would be a child with typically developing language. And that is what all of the standardized testing, the parent-teacher questionnaires, and the language samples pointed to. In case 2, we also had 100% consensus that this was a child that was presenting with language impairment. And this was confirmatory for what Records and Tomlin in 1994 found. Now, they only looked at standardized testing in their study, but they found when standardized test scores clearly fell above or below normal limits, all SLPs were able to agree and came to the same diagnostic decision. But what happened for those incongruent cases? For cases 3 and 4, when standardized testing measures and those other measures weren't giving you the same data. So remember, for case 3, those quote unquote informal measures like the parent and teacher questionnaire and the language sample was what we would consider below normal limits or having concerns. And standardized testing was considered to be within normal limits. 93% of our SLPs, so all but one SLP, concluded that this was a child that presented with typically developing language skills, meaning their diagnostic decisions followed what was happening with the standardized testing and not what is happening with informal measures. This was also the case in case 4. Now remember here, the standardized testing was showing below normal or outside average limits for language performance, but our informal language measures were not showing any language concerns. In this case, 86% of those SLPs provided a diagnosis of language impairment, showing us again that the data for standardized testing was most relied on and is usually where the direction would go in terms of decisions. Our borderline case, we also saw some uniformity here, and that individuals believed that this was a case with typical developing language, and we did have some SLPs that would have indicated some monitoring or to follow up. So what is this really telling us? This is again showing us that standardized testing is the primary tool that SLPs are relying on to make and guide their diagnostic decisions. So why is standardized testing so pervasive? Why is it that primary assessment tool? So again, my colleagues and I in a qualitative interview asked SLPs why they rely on standardized testing. Why is this an assessment tool that they used? And these were 4 of the primary themes that they discussed about rationale for using standardized tests. And especially SLPs really are relying on these tools because they measure specific skills in a way that is, they believe, is comprehensive, and they can do this in a way that is easy to administer and is time effective. And in addition, many SLPs are mistakenly perceiving that standardized testing is mandatory in school settings because of districts, policies, or different laws or policies that at the district, state, or other federal and local levels. And what you're really going to be seeing as you're going through this course is that while you're perceiving standardized testing as a mandatory component and as maybe the most important or only data that you need to use for diagnostic decision making, this is really not the case. And so is it ethical and is this part of evidence-based practice to rely so heavily upon standardized testing when making diagnostic decisions? The short answer here is no. Any evaluator who's only using one test to identify a disability or a language impairment is really violating evidence-based practice and is going against the ASHA Code of Ethics. And as SLPs, we really need to make sure that we understand how standardized testing is built and that we are considering the psychometric qualities, the reliability, the validity, and the diagnostic accuracy of standardized testing to make sure it is really appropriate for the children that we are assessing. And so there are major concerns with standardized testing. Not all standardized tests that SLPs are using to diagnose language impairment are reliable, valid, and are diagnostically accurate. So one question to ask yourself in selecting standardized assessments is, does this standardized test that I'm using include measures of discriminant accuracy like sensitivity and specificity? Is it actually designed to diagnose children with language impairments? And how has that been tested? And does your standardized test, is it updated and does it consider what we now know about child language development, or is it still being built on theories that were used 30, 40, or 50 years ago? And think about your own unique identity as a human being and all of its intersections, all of your different interests, all of the parts that make up who you are, where you came from, your religious background, ethnic background, racial background. How does that all impact testing performance? And do you really think all of those idiosyncrasies and intersections can accurately be caught and measured by a standardized test? I really don't think that's the case. And what about evidence-based practice? Something that we know as school-based SLPs we need to be following. Again, in our study as well as other studies, we found that when discussing evidence-based practices, school-based practitioners are really viewing this as something that we do for treatment and not for assessment, which is a huge barrier and a huge impact. Evidence-based practice is for all of the services we render, assessment and treatment. And that SLPs are typically using external scientific research evidence under 2 very specific circumstances. One, when they feel that they lack the clinical expertise or they haven't had specific one-on-one experience with that client's diagnosis. And in the second instance, when they need to provide evidence or support to other professionals or other parents about a treatment method that they're already utilizing. I really believe that this isn't the essence of what evidence-based practice is. In addition, SLPs may not be always accessing the best, most high quality, peer-reviewed research evidence, and that typically sources that are going from general internet searches on Google or ASHA is what's being used. And so we really need to consider and do some self-reflection on our own practices and really understand what we're using to assess, why we assess them, and are they reaching the ultimate language goals of correctly diagnosing children with language impairment.
This video and a number of others showing our change makers will go together to form an online course available at leadersproject.org that will also be offered for ASHA CEUs. It will be free, and you will meet your ethical and culturally responsive requirements